My name is Clara Weston. I am 36 years old, and I have spent most of my career reading the ocean the way other people read contracts, looking past the surface for the current underneath, the one that actually decides where everything ends up. I am a marine ecologist. I assess coastal health for a living, the chemistry of water, the integrity of reefs, the invisible architecture of things that keep an entire ecosystem from collapsing. My clients are developers, governments, conservation organizations. My job is to tell people the truth about what they are standing on before they build something on top of it. You would think a father would be proud of a daughter who spent her life separating solid ground from the appearance of it. My father, Edward Weston, was not that father. I want to start at the wedding, because the wedding is where the visible part of this story begins, and because some endings deserve to be named before you understand how long they were coming. The ceremony was small by design, a converted boat shed on a tidal creek in coastal Georgia, 30 chairs, afternoon light coming through salt-hazed windows, the smell of low tide and pine. My husband, James Calloway, had found the place. He'd done almost everything logistical for that wedding, quietly, without being asked, the way he did most things. He'd rented chairs from a church supply company 40 minutes away, hauled them himself in a borrowed truck, set them up on the worn plank floor at 6 in the morning before I'd even had coffee. When I arrived in the dress my grandmother's seamstress had altered for me, the room was ready, the light was right, and the man I was marrying was standing at the end of the aisle with grease under one fingernail and a look on his face that I have never, in 3 years of marriage, been able to improve on. My father arrived at 11:45, 15 minutes before the ceremony, with my mother Patricia and my older brother Garrett in a car I recognized as the resort company's SUV, which told me immediately that this was not a family visit, but a performance review. He sat through the ceremony in silence. He is a man who understands that silence, deployed correctly, is louder than objection. I felt it the way you feel a change in barometric pressure, not yet a storm, but a definite alteration in the quality of the air. He shook James's hand afterward with the precise pressure a man uses when he wants to communicate that he is tolerating something. The reception was at the same shed, rearranged with food from a local restaurant and 2 cases of wine James had driven 3 hours to select from a small vineyard he admired. The table was laid simply. There were wildflowers from a farm stand in mason jars. It was the most beautiful room I had ever sat down to eat in, and I want to put that on record clearly, because what happened in it was ugly enough that the beauty deserves its own line. My father stood up before the main course was cleared. He is a man who has delivered keynote addresses to rooms of 400 investors. He knows how to hold a room. He held that one. All 30 people. The 8 from his world who'd come out of obligation and the 22 from mine who'd come out of love. All of them settling into quiet the way people do when they sense that something definitive is about to be said. I've spent 30 years building something, my father said, glass raised, voice the precise temperature of a controlled burn. Something that has paid for private schools and graduate degrees and opportunities most people's children never see. I did that because I believed in legacy. I believed in building something worth passing on. A pause, deliberate, the kind a man practices. Today, my daughter has decided to pass on all of it. She has married a man who makes his living hauling fish out of the water at 4 in the morning and calling it a career. He looked at James without hostility, which was somehow worse than hostility. James, I'm sure you're a decent man. I have no doubt you care about my daughter. But decency doesn't build a legacy, and caring doesn't pay a mortgage when the season's bad. He turned back to the room. Clara has made her choice. As of today, she makes it without my financial support. The trust my father established, the shares in Weston Coastal Properties, the apartment in Savannah, those remain in the family. Clara has chosen a different family. I wish her well with it." He sat down. He picked up his fork. 30 people sat in varying states of shock, embarrassment, or the performative neutrality of people who have decided not to pick a side in front of witnesses. My mother touched her napkin to the corner of a dry eye. Garrett studied his wine glass with the focused attention of a man who has never once in his life stood between my father and anything he wanted to do. James reached across the table and covered my hand with his. His palm was warm and steady. He didn't say anything, and I have loved him, I think, most clearly in the moments when he understands that silence is the answer. I looked at my father and felt something shift inside me. Not break, not shatter the way people describe it in films. Something more like the moment a navigation instrument finally locks onto a signal it's been searching for. A kind of terrible clarity. An arrival. "Thank you for the toast," I said. And then I stood up, because I had not prepared a speech and did not need one. I spent 28 years trying to be the kind of daughter who could sit at my father's table and be worth something to him. I got a PhD doing it. I published research doing it. I turned down 3 positions in other states doing it, because I wanted to stay close enough that he might eventually look at what I'd built and find it acceptable. I paused. Not for drama, just because the next sentence needed its own space. Today, I understand that acceptable was never the standard. Controllable was the standard. And James is the first person I've ever chosen who cannot be controlled by my father, which is the actual thing this toast is about. I raised my own glass. To choosing people who love you the way you actually are, and to the 30 people in this room who showed up today for exactly that reason. I drank. I sat down. And from the 22 who were mine, there was a sound. Not thunderous, not performative, but real. The particular warmth of people applauding because they mean it rather than because the room requires it. My father left before the cake. My mother followed him. Garrett paused at the door long enough to give me a look that I interpreted as something between apology and self-preservation, and then he followed too. And the 22 people who remained ate the best meal I have ever eaten at a wedding, in a room full of low tide and pine and wildflowers in mason jars, while my husband told my graduate school advisor a long and genuinely funny story about the worst weather he'd ever navigated, and I sat beside him thinking, very quietly and with great precision, I need to understand what I am building now. Let me go back, because the wedding makes no sense without the decade before it. My father came from a family of modest means, his words and accurate ones, the one place where his honesty was reliable. His grandfather had owned a bait shop on the Georgia coast. His own father had expanded it to a marina, then lost the marina in a bad partnership, and my father had spent his entire adult life building, with extraordinary discipline and genuine talent, what he called a reclamation project. Weston Coastal Properties now owns 11 luxury resort properties along the Atlantic seaboard. The company employs around 2,000 people. My father, by any external measure, has earned the right to be proud of what he made. The difficulty, and I say this with the precision of someone who spent years trying to understand it rather than simply resent it, is that my father confused the story of what he'd built with the story of his children's lives. We were not, to him, separate people with separate purposes. We were chapters in a continuing narrative that he was writing, and his authorial relationship to us was not generous. He edited constantly. He had a vision of the ending, and he revised toward it without consultation. Garrett, my brother, is 4 years older and understood this early. He made himself useful to the narrative. He went into hospitality management, joined the company at 24, sits on the board now, plays golf with investors, and has, in exchange for all of this, a life of considerable comfort and zero original thought. I do not say that cruelly. I say it observationally, the way I would note the salinity of water that has been sitting in a closed system for too long. I went the other direction, not as an act of rebellion. I want to be clear about that, because my father has always preferred the rebellion narrative, which allows him to cast himself as the wronged party and me as the ingrate. I went into marine ecology because I was 11 years old, the summer my grandfather took me out in his small aluminum boat to check on an oyster bed he'd been nurturing for 3 seasons, and the way he talked about the water, with knowledge and respect, and the particular tenderness a person reserves for things they understand deeply, produced in me a feeling I have chased professionally ever since. I went into the ocean because the ocean interested me more than anything else available. My father funded my undergraduate degree on the explicit condition that I would apply those scientific credentials to the Weston portfolio: environmental compliance work, sustainability optics, the kind of credentialing that makes resort developments palatable to regulators. I understood the condition. I accepted it. I told myself at 18 that I could honor the condition and also do real work, that the two were not mutually exclusive. By the time I finished my doctorate at 27, I understood they were. The work my father wanted was what I came to think of as decorative science, the kind of environmental assessment that finds what the client needs it to find, that navigates toward approvals rather than toward truth. I had spent 6 years in graduate school learning to read coastal systems honestly, and honesty was not, it turned out, what Weston Coastal Properties required of its in-house ecologist. What it required was a qualified signature on documents that said what they were going to say, regardless of my signature. I left the company at 29. I have never fully explained this to my father, because he did not want an explanation. He wanted an apology and a return, and when neither materialized, he simply moved the incident into his private ledger under the heading of ingratitude and found other ways to make his dissatisfaction felt. The trust fund distributions slowed and became irregular. The apartment in Savannah, which had always been presented as mine to use, was suddenly needed during the months I was between leases. Invitations to family events arrived late, or not at all, and my absence was noted publicly in the language of disappointment. I built a practice instead. Small at first, water quality assessments, reef health surveys, the kind of work that pays modestly and matters significantly. I contracted with nonprofits, with small municipalities, with developers who actually wanted to know the truth before committing to a site. I published papers. I cultivated a reputation in a narrow field for being someone whose conclusions could be trusted because they were not for sale. By the time I met James, I had a company with 4 employees, a roster of contracts that covered my overhead with a little leftover, and a very clear sense of the difference between the work I had been asked to do for my family and the work I was actually capable of doing. I met James at a boat launch at 5:45 in the morning, which is where people like us tend to meet people like each other. I was out early to collect water samples from a tidal creek where a development client was proposing to put a marina. James was backing a flat-bottomed boat into the water with the economical precision of a man who has done the same thing several thousand times. He noticed me in the shallows with my sample bottles and said, without preamble, "That creek's got an algae problem at the north end. Been there for 2 seasons. Might want to pull samples from the south side if you're trying to get a clean read." I looked at him. He was in waders and a salt-faded jacket, hair still showing the compress of a hat he'd apparently just taken off. He was not telling me my job. He was sharing information he thought I didn't have, the way you'd do with a colleague. "What kind of algae?" I asked. He told me, in accurate taxonomic terms, and then he told me what he thought was causing it. And he was right about the first and partially right about the second. And when I corrected the second part, he nodded and said, "Makes sense. I was working from observation, not testing." And then he launched his boat and went about his morning, and I went about mine, and at the ramp on my way back out I saw him again, and he said, without particular ceremony, "I'm getting coffee if you want some." And we sat in his truck with paper cups from a gas station and talked about the creek for 40 minutes. And at the end of it, he said, "What are you finding out here generally? Is it as bad as people say?" He meant the whole coastal system, the question a person asks when they actually want to know. Nobody in my family had ever asked me a question like that. Questions in my family were instruments. They extracted information you could use to make a decision that had already been made. James asked questions the way a navigator takes soundings, because the answer would genuinely change where he went next. We dated for 8 months before I introduced him to my family. I want to be honest about why. Not because I was ashamed of him, but because I had spent enough years around my father to know exactly what that introduction would produce, and I wanted to arrive at it from a position of clarity rather than defensiveness. I wanted to know, before he met my father, that what I felt for James was solid enough to withstand my father's assessment of it. I tested it the way I test everything, not with feeling, but with time and repeated examination. It was solid. I introduced him. My father had James investigated within the week. I know this not because James told me, but because the investigator my father uses for due diligence on business partners, a man named Corbin who had done background checks on Weston resort managers for 2 decades, ran into a friend of mine at a marina bar, and my friend mentioned it, amused, assuming I already knew. I didn't. I filed it away without confronting my father, because I was more interested in what he would do with the information than in penalizing him for gathering it. What he did with it was invite James to dinner at the house in Sea Island, which is my father's idea of neutral territory, but is in fact a room designed from the carpet up to communicate the precise weight of Weston family money, and across the longest part of that meal, while my mother distributed pleasant nothings and Garrett talked about a golf course investment, my father asked James questions in the tone of a man conducting an oral examination for which he has already graded the answer sheet. James answered everything directly and without embellishment. He ran a small commercial fishing operation, he said. A few boats, a modest crew, long seasons, variable income. He lived on the water because he couldn't imagine living otherwise. He had no family wealth and no particular interest in acquiring anyone else's. He said this last part with a mildness that I recognized by then as a specific quality of his. The mildness of a man who is not trying to persuade you of anything because he has no investment in whether you are persuaded. My father looked at James across the length of that table and said, with the particular courtesy that is colder than open contempt, "Clara has a gift for the unconventional. I've always admired her independence, even when I've disagreed with her choices." James looked at him and said, pleasantly, "She's the best scientist I've ever watched work. What she does with a water column and a set of sample bottles is genuinely remarkable. You must be proud." My father smiled in the way of a man who has been outmaneuvered by a sentence he can't object to, and changed the subject to real estate. In the car afterward, I asked James what he'd thought. He was quiet for a moment, watching the marsh go dark on either side of the causeway. "He's a man who built something real," James said, and then confused the thing he built with the people who loved him. It's a common mistake. Doesn't make him a bad person. Just makes him an incorrect one. I thought about that sentence for months afterward, the way you think about a result that clarifies something you'd been measuring wrong. When I told my father we were engaged, he said what I had known he would say, that James was a decent man, but not a serious one. That the fishing industry was not a foundation for the kind of life I had been raised to expect. That I was making a sentimental decision in middle age because I had spent too many years alone, and that he would support me, financially, emotionally, in every way, if I would simply take a little more time and consider what I was actually choosing. I told him I was choosing James. He said he hoped I understood what I was giving up. I told him I understood it better than he thought. That conversation happened in February. By June, he stood up at my wedding and told 30 people I had forfeited my inheritance. By June, something in the relationship that had been bending under its own weight for 15 years had finally, definitively, set down. Here is what I did not do in the weeks after the wedding. I did not call him to negotiate or to beg or to explain. Again, the argument that he had heard and rejected many times already. I had spent 28 years making the argument that my choices deserved respect, and 28 years of evidence was sufficient to tell me the argument itself was not the problem. The problem was that my father did not want to be persuaded. He wanted to be obeyed, and failing obedience, he wanted drama. The confrontation, the tearful scene, the daughter who eventually returned, chastened and grateful. He had built the architecture of family crises to produce a particular kind of capitulation, and I had, until this point, always arrived at it eventually. I did not arrive at it. I called my lawyer instead. I called her because I needed to understand precisely what had been threatened and what was real. The Savannah apartment. Real. His name. No legal claim on my part. The trust fund. Complicated, dependent on language I needed to examine. The company shares. His to reassign as he chose. I sat with all of this for a week and built a spreadsheet. I have built spreadsheets in crisis for as long as I can remember, because a crisis with numbers in it is more manageable than a crisis without them, and the numbers in this one, once I had them all in front of me, told me something useful. I was fine. Not comfortable, not padded, but fine, sustainable, solvent, capable of operating without my father's architecture, which I had known abstractly for years but had never had to prove because the architecture had always been there. James did not ask me what was in the spreadsheet. He sat across the kitchen table from me while I built it, reading a technical manual of some kind, and when I finally closed the laptop, he looked up and said, "Are you okay?" I told him the numbers worked. He said that wasn't what he'd asked. I told him I was figuring out what okay meant when the thing you'd been hoping for your whole life finally stopped being possible. He put down the manual, and we sat there for a while in the particular quiet of a small house near the water at night, and it was enough. He was, and has continued to be, enough. There were things about James that did not add up. I want to be precise about this, because I was a scientist before I was a wife, and I am not a person who ignores data, even data I do not yet know how to interpret. He took calls at odd hours, outside, in a low voice, using language that was not fishing language. "The Port Authority wants the timeline moved up," I heard him say once. "Tell Morrison to push back. We don't move a construction schedule to accommodate a bureaucratic preference." A fisherman does not have a Morrison to dispatch against bureaucratic preferences. A fisherman also does not, as I discovered when I helped organize the hall closet one Sunday, own 4 different passports from legitimate international travel to places: Norway, New Zealand, Japan, Chile, that correspond precisely with the locations of the largest sustainable fisheries operations in the Southern Hemisphere. He drove a truck that was 12 years old and looked like it had spent most of those years at a boat ramp. He wore clothes from marine supply catalogs. He cooked dinner on weeknights and did the grocery shopping with the focused, unhurried efficiency of a man who has learned to be self-sufficient in places where the nearest store is 40 minutes away. None of this was inconsistent with the man I had been told he was. Some of it was inconsistent with things I was noticing. The crews who worked on his boats called him Captain. Not James, not Jay, not anything informal. Captain. With a particular weight that I had come to associate, in my professional life, with genuine institutional authority rather than simple courtesy. I did not ask directly. We had agreed, early in our relationship, on an understanding I would not have been able to articulate then, but can now, that we would offer each other our truths as we were ready to give them, rather than demanding them before they were ready to come. It was not a rule we had discussed. It was a quality of the relationship that had simply established itself, the way a good current does. Not imposed. Just true. What changed my calculation was a magazine. It arrived as part of a stack of trade publications that accumulated on the hall table. James subscribed to several, the way people subscribe to things relevant to their actual professional lives, and I had stopped noticing them the way you stop noticing the texture of a floor you walk on every day. But one evening, I picked one up while waiting for water to boil, and the cover story was about a company I had encountered professionally, abstractly, without ever connecting it to anything personal. Blue Meridian Holdings, a marine technology and sustainable fisheries company founded 15 years ago by a person described as notoriously private, someone the industry knew principally through results rather than public presence. A company that had revolutionized 3 different aspects of commercial sustainable fishing and was currently developing what the article called the most sophisticated coastal monitoring network ever attempted in the North Atlantic. A company whose founder had, in 15 years, never given an interview, never appeared at an industry conference under his own name, and had consequently accumulated the particular mystique that attaches to effective people who decline to perform their effectiveness. The article included no photograph of the founder. It included a quote from a regional manager named Morrison. I put the magazine down. I picked it back up. I thought about Norway, New Zealand, Japan, Chile. I thought about the passport stack in the hall closet. I thought about Morrison and the construction schedule. I thought about the way the crews said captain. I thought about the question James had asked me, months earlier, sitting in his truck with gas station coffee. What are you finding out here generally? Is it as bad as people say? The question a man asks when the answer will genuinely change where he goes next. I did not say anything that night. I went to bed and lay awake for a long time in the particular dark of a house near tidal water, listening to the marsh, doing arithmetic I had been avoiding for months because the answer was too large for the kitchen it was happening in. I told him the next morning that I'd read the article about Blue Meridian. He was making coffee. He was quiet for a moment, his back to me. Then he turned around and said, "How long have you known?" "About 12 hours, I said. "How long were you going to wait?" He set down the cup and came to sit across from me and said, with the directness I had loved about him from the beginning, "Until you were ready to hear it differently than you'd hear it now." I asked what that meant. "Right now," he said, "you're still in the part where your father's voice is loud. The part where someone you loved made you feel like you'd made a foolish choice, and you're still proving to yourself that you didn't. I didn't want the money to be the proof. I wanted you to know it was a good choice before the money showed up to say so." I sat with that for a long time. "You could have told me," I said. "I should have told you sooner," he said. "I won't defend the timing. I hid what I had. I never hid what I felt. If those aren't the same thing to you, tell me now, and we'll figure out what comes next." We sat across the kitchen table with the coffee getting cold between us, and I thought about what it meant that a man who had built, by the numbers I was now calculating in my head, something large enough to be called a company worth several $100 million, had spent 8 months eating dinners at my kitchen table without once making me feel like I was the smaller person at it. I thought about the question he'd asked me at the boat launch, the way he'd let me correct him about the algae, and had nodded and said, "Makes sense. The 12 years on the truck. The marine supply catalog clothes. I need you to tell me everything now," I said. He did. Here is the version that matters for this story. Blue Meridian Holdings was real, was James's, had been built from a single leased boat and a processing contract 15 years ago, and had grown. Through a combination of genuine innovation and the kind of disciplined operational intelligence that my father mistook for a genetic inheritance he'd granted, into one of the most significant companies in sustainable commercial fisheries. It had recently been approached by three separate entities for partnership on a coastal development project that James had described to me, in the language of a man being very precise with a scientist, as significant. He had declined all three on the grounds that their environmental assessments were decorative science, and he did not build things on top of decorative science. He described the assessments using language I recognized. It was the language of my former career at Weston Coastal Properties. I asked him which developer had approached him. He told me. I want to tell you what I felt in that moment, because the feeling was complex, and I think the complexity matters. I felt no triumph. I want to be clear about that, because this story could be told as a revenge story, and it is not, precisely, a revenge story. What I felt was something closer to the feeling I get when a dataset finally resolves. The satisfaction of a pattern becoming legible, not the satisfaction of a wound becoming paid. I had spent a year building a life that had nothing to do with my father's assessment of it, and the life was good, the life was real, and the revelation that my husband was a man of considerably more consequence than my father had believed was not the point of the life. It was a fact about the life, and a fact, unlike a triumph, simply needs to be acknowledged. James looked at me across the table and said, I want to be clear that the business decision was made before I understood the full personal dimension of it. I said, I know. He said, and I want to be clear that the personal dimension would not have changed the business decision. I said, I know that too. He said, what do you want to do? And I told him what I'd been thinking since somewhere around 2 in the morning, lying in the dark listening to the marsh. I told him I wanted to do nothing. I wanted to let the work speak for itself in a room full of people, the way work always should. I wanted to walk into whatever room the truth was going to become visible in, and simply stand there. Not with a speech prepared, not with a knife ready, but with the calm of a person who has been doing the right thing for long enough that the right thing no longer requires her to announce itself. He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, there's an event, 3 weeks. Opening ceremony for the Blue Meridian Coastal Monitoring Network. It's the first time I've appeared publicly in any company capacity. There are going to be people there who've been trying to identify me for years. He paused. Your father was invited as part of a developers consortium. Standard courtesy. I didn't know until after the invitations went out. I asked if he had considered withdrawing the invitation. He said he hadn't. I asked why not. He said, because the work is real, and the work should stand in front of everyone who ever doubted either of us. That's not revenge. That's just accuracy. I said, I'll be there. He said, I was hoping you'd say that. Not as your wife? I added. He raised an eyebrow. I mean not only as your wife, I said. I want to be there as myself. And then I told him about the consulting contract I had received 3 months earlier from the State Coastal Management Authority. A contract to provide independent verification of the water quality baseline data for exactly the coastal zone where the Blue Meridian Monitoring Network was being installed. I had been doing the work for weeks. I had not connected it to James's company because I did not yet know they were the same project. And now I understood, with the very specific satisfaction of an ecologist, that the data I had been collecting in sample bottles and processing in my lab was the same data that underpinned the network my husband had built. He stared at me. You've been my independent verifier, he said. Apparently, I said. He started laughing then, really laughing, the way he almost never did. And I laughed too, because there is a particular absurdity to the universe sometimes that is too precisely calibrated to be accidental, and the only appropriate response to it is laughter. The data's good? He asked when he could speak again. The data is excellent, I said. The baseline is clean. The methodology is sound, and the conclusions are mine, and they're accurate, and no one asked me to shade them in any direction. He reached across the table and took my hand. Walter would say your grandfather left you the calipers, Fontaine, he said. I'm saying the ocean left you the data. I told him he was getting sentimental. He said he was allowed. My father arrived at the opening ceremony in the company SUV, accompanied by my mother, by Garrett, and by 3 members of the Weston Coastal Properties Board, all of them in the particular uniform of coastal wealth, linen that was expensive enough to look casual, shoes that had never been near the water they were presently decorated. The event was held at a marine research station on a barrier island, a converted 1940s Coast Guard facility that had been renovated with the precision of people who cared more about function than appearance. 400 guests, researchers, regulators, conservationists, commercial fishers, journalists from 3 different marine industry publications. The kind of room that my father did not typically attend because it was a room organized around the ocean's actual condition rather than its promotional potential. He had come because Blue Meridian had invited the developers consortium. He had come, I understood, because he had been trying for 2 years to secure a partnership with the company that was about to be revealed as my husband's, and the grand opening of its flagship monitoring network was the occasion that had finally produced an in-person invitation. He saw me near the registration table, and the sequence of expressions that crossed his face was almost precisely what I had expected: surprise, recalibration, the recovery of cordiality. Clara, he said warmly for the benefit of my mother at his elbow, I didn't know you'd be here. I'm presenting the water quality baseline findings, I said. My firm was contracted to provide independent verification. A flicker. Your firm. My firm, I confirmed. 4 employees now. We've been doing coastal baseline work for the state authority for 18 months. I said it without particular emphasis, the way you'd note a relevant credential at a professional event, which was, after all, what it was. My father processed this. And James? He said. He's here, I said. He'll be presenting as well. My mother had been watching me with the careful attention of a woman who has learned to read the room before she commits to an expression. Something moved in her eyes that I could not fully interpret and did not have time to examine because the ceremony was beginning, and I needed to find my seat. I presented first 30 minutes of water quality baseline data, methodology notes, conclusions. The room received it with the attention scientists give to solid work, which is a specific quality of attention that I had spent 15 years trying to produce in audiences and still find moving when it arrives. When I stepped down, I did not look at my father's table. I had said what was true about the water, and the water did not require his endorsement. James was introduced last. The ceremony had built to it deliberately. The MC walked the audience through the company's history, the technology, the network architecture, the scope of what was being inaugurated, and then said, for 15 years, the founder of Blue Meridian Holdings has built one of the most significant environmental monitoring infrastructures in the history of commercial fisheries without ever appearing in front of an audience. Tonight, that changes. I watched my father's face from across the room. He was looking at the stage with the focused anticipation of a man who has been waiting for a meeting for 2 years. His expression was alert, prepared, the expression of someone about to make an impression. And then James walked onto the stage, and the expression changed. It did not crumble dramatically. My father is not a man who crumbles dramatically in public. He is too experienced, too controlled for that. But there was a moment, 3 or 4 seconds, in which his face was simply absent, the way a signal drops, and for a moment there's nothing. Not static, just the absence of what was there before. The color left him. His hand moved slightly on the table, knocking the edge of his water glass without registering that it had. My mother pressed her fingertips to her mouth. Garrett went very still. James spoke for 20 minutes about the ocean and what it was telling us, about the network and what it would allow us to hear, about the researchers and crews who had built it without caring whose name was on the incorporation documents. He said nothing about my family. He said nothing about the consortium that had been courting him. He spoke about the water the way he had spoken about it to me at a boat launch at 5:45 in the morning, and the room, researchers, regulators, fishers, journalists, received it with the quality of attention that only accurate things produce in people who spend their lives trying to distinguish accuracy from its imitations. Afterward, in the receiving crowd, my father reached James before anyone else. This did not surprise me. My father is a man who has spent his life understanding that momentum belongs to whoever moves first. James, he said, hand extended, voice carrying the register he uses for major clients. This is extraordinary. I've been looking forward to meeting you for a very long time. James took the hand. He shook it once and released it. I know, he said. You've been quite persistent. My father laughed. The short, controlled laugh of a man managing a situation he is still calculating. Well, when the best operation in the industry keeps the lights off, you do what you can. He gestured in my direction without looking at me. I had no idea you and Clara. She certainly kept her secrets. Clara doesn't keep secrets, James said pleasantly. She presents findings when the data's ready. A pause. About the partnership, my father said. The consortium has been in conversations with your regional team for some time. I think if we could sit down, we won't be sitting down, James said, and the mildness was exactly what I remembered from the night he'd told my father, at our wedding dinner, that my choices were my choices to make. No heat, no enjoyment. Simply a statement of fact, with the weight of a decision already made. I reviewed the consortium's environmental assessments 8 months ago and declined to proceed on the grounds that the methodology didn't meet our standards. That position hasn't changed. My father's jaw set. Those assessments were prepared by a qualified firm. They were prepared by a firm that was asked to find a specific conclusion, James said. We work with Clara's approach. She wasn't asked to find anything. She was asked to find the truth, and she did. My father looked at me then, not with fury, with something more disorienting, something I had seen on his face perhaps twice in my adult life. The expression of a man who is genuinely uncertain what comes next. The expression of someone who has walked out onto a surface he assessed as solid and is standing still, waiting to find out if it holds. You came here to watch this happen, he said, and it wasn't quite an accusation. I came here to present my findings, I said. The rest was already true. It just needed a room big enough to be visible in. I took the brass calipers out of my bag. Not my grandfather's in this story, my own. The ones I had bought secondhand from a marine supply liquidation sale in my second year of graduate school, when I was paying for everything myself, and buying secondhand was the only option. I had carried them for 12 years. They were not a sentimental object. They were a working tool that I happened to have used long enough that they fit my hand exactly. I held them up where he could see them. You told me my work was a distraction, I said. A credential without a purpose. You said the science was fine as a hobby but not a foundation. I turned the calipers once in my fingers. I have been measuring coastlines for 12 years, and the measurements have been right, and the coastlines are still standing because of people who knew how to take an accurate reading and were not asked to adjust it for anybody's convenience. I put them back in my bag. The only thing I needed from you was for you to look at the work. You never did. So I stopped waiting for you to, and went and found a room where it would be seen. He was quiet for a long moment. Around us, the event was continuing. People circulating, conversations overlapping, the sound of 400 people inhabiting a room built around important work. We were an island in the middle of it. I didn't know what you were doing, he said, And then, in a lower register, the one I associated with the rare moments in my childhood when my father spoke without a script, I didn't ask. No, I said. You didn't. He looked at James for a moment, then back at me. Your husband builds things, he said. It was not an apology. It was an accounting. A man recalculating a column he had entered wrong. He does, I said. So do I. So did the man you called a grease stain. So does nearly everyone in this room, which is why they're here, and why this network matters, and why none of it needed your approval to be real. My mother touched his elbow. Garrett was saying something quietly from somewhere behind him. The world was moving around my father in its ordinary way, and he was standing in it with the face of a man who has discovered, mid-construction, that the load-bearing assumptions were wrong. He nodded. Once. The small nod of a man taking a measurement he does not yet know what to do with. Then he said, Is there a way for me to see the baseline report? Your report. I looked at him. It's a public document, I said. It's been filed with the state authority. Anyone can read it. I know, he said. I'm asking if I can read it. I told him yes. I told him it was 86 pages and the methodology section was detailed and he should not skip it. He nodded again, and then the crowd moved between us. And that was the whole conversation. I want to tell you what happened in the year that followed, because I think the year matters more than the event. The Blue Meridian Monitoring Network was inaugurated on schedule. It is, by any objective measure, one of the most significant coastal monitoring installations on the eastern seaboard, and the baseline data it is cross-referenced against, my baseline data, is cited in papers now, in regulatory filings, in environmental assessments for projects I have nothing to do with. The work stands. The work will stand long after everyone who came to that opening ceremony has forgotten who said what in the receiving room afterward. Weston Coastal Properties did not secure the Blue Meridian partnership. My father restructured the consortium's approach to environmental compliance, hired a different assessment firm with a different methodology, and lost a development contract in North Carolina when the regulatory authority declined to approve an assessment that did not meet the state's newly revised standards that had been, in part, updated in response to the kind of baseline work my firm had been producing. I was not involved in that decision. I want to be precise about that. The standards changed because standards change when enough accurate data accumulates, and accurate data accumulates when enough people commit to collecting it honestly. I did not engineer my father's regulatory problem. The regulatory problem was the predictable result of a decade of decorative science, and what I had done was simply never participate in it. My father called me 4 months after the opening ceremony, not through my mother, not through Garrett. He called me directly on a Tuesday afternoon, and I answered because I have a policy of answering direct communications from people, even when I expect the conversation to be difficult. He said, I read the baseline report. I said, all 86 pages? He said, including the methodology section. I said, what did you think? He was quiet for a moment, then, I think I owe you a long conversation, and I'm not sure I'm ready to have it yet, but I wanted to call and say I read it. I told him I appreciated the call. He said, James was right that you don't keep secrets. You do the work, and you let the work be the argument. That's what my professors taught me, I said. I should have listened to your professors, he said. We talked for 20 minutes. Not about the wedding, not about the inheritance, not about any of the specific entries in the ledger I had been keeping since I was 9 years old. We talked about the methodology. He asked questions about the sampling approach, about the equipment, about what the data was actually telling us about long-term coastal health. He asked real questions, the kind where the answer would change where he went next. At the end of the call, he said, Can I see the shop sometime, where you work? I told him to give me a few weeks' notice. He has come twice since. He sits at the work table in the corner while I process samples and asks questions, and I answer them. And sometimes he offers observations that are wrong, and I tell him they're wrong. And he nods and accepts the correction the way James had nodded and accepted the correction about the algae on the morning we met. It is a small thing. It is, as far as I can tell, the first true thing we have ever done together. My mother sends careful emails. She has not, to my knowledge, apologized for the performance at the wedding, but she has begun asking about the work with a specificity that suggests she has been reading about it, which is its own kind of accounting. Garrett and I text occasionally, which is more than we have managed in 5 years. I do not know what these threads will eventually hold, and I have learned, professionally and personally, not to predict the tensile strength of a material until you have tested it under actual load. James still drives the 12-year-old truck. He still goes to the hangar most mornings. He came home last month with grease on his collar and the specific contentment of a man who has spent the day doing something he is genuinely good at, and I told him that his collar was ruined, and he said he had other collars, and we had dinner at the kitchen table with the tide coming in outside the window and the particular quiet of a house where nothing needs to be performed. My father called me decorative. My father called James a man without a foundation. He said those things in a small boat shed in front of 30 people and thought he was delivering a verdict. What he was actually doing was taking a measurement with a broken instrument and mistaking the reading for the truth. Here is what I have learned. Collecting data from the ocean for 12 years, the ocean does not negotiate its condition to suit the report. It is what it is, at whatever depth you choose to measure. And the only question is whether you are willing to take the reading honestly or whether you need it to say something specific before you take it. The people who need it to say something specific make decisions that eventually fail when the structure meets the actual load. The people who take the honest reading make decisions that hold. I took the honest reading. I have always taken the honest reading, from the water and from my life, and the only thing that has ever cost me was the approval of people who needed a different number. It cost me. I want to say that plainly. It cost me years of trying and years of hoping and a wedding day that should have been only beautiful and a trust fund I will never see and a relationship with my father that I am still, at 36, working out how to hold. Those are real costs. I do not minimize them. But here is what the honest reading gave me: James, and the work, and a baseline data set that will outlast all of us, and a company I built from a second-hand pair of calipers, and a commitment to not adjusting the conclusion. And some mornings, very early, when the tide is low and the creek is quiet, and the light is just starting, and I have my sample bottles and my notebook, and there is nobody yet in the world but the marsh and the herons and me. Some mornings, standing in that particular water, I think about the girl who went into marine ecology because an old man took her out in an aluminum boat and talked about the ocean with respect. And I think, she got here. She got exactly here. The water doesn't care whose daughter you are. It only cares if you can read it. And I can. I always could.